Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
I'm political analyst Al Spry. A little bit of history for you folks today with Daniel Stashower. The name of the book is The Hour of Peril.
Daniel, normally a mystery writer and an award winner at that, and he's brought his talents to a true historical conspiracy. This seems to be a year for conspiracies. So we'll invite you to put an ear on the radio. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. Reagan, it's always great to see you, my friend.
I look forward to these weekly visits of ours, Al, where we have a chance to dissect some of the things that are going on in the political world, the news around Florida, and the nation as well.
Well, we have all kinds of things to talk about today.
We do,
But
yes.
First... I want to say hi, everybody, in TV land. Al Spry here on Tough TV 38. You can check us out on Tough TV 38 over the air. If you want to get us on your cable operator or your satellite provider, all you do is give them a call, write them an email, say, I want my Tough TV. Tough TV 38 will be yours because, you know, in people have the power. You just have to exercise and get your Tough TV. Now.
Yeah.
Let's talk medical marijuana.
All right.
And here's why. I want us to give us a collective pat on the back here at Florida Roundtable. Of course, you know we are at the cutting edge of this societal and political issue. We had John Morgan on last month.
Yeah, we did.
Great interview with him. And, well, lo and behold, this is the power of Florida Roundtable. Because you heard, you wrote, you stood up for your rights, and now we're going to have a medical marijuana initiative on the ballot.
John got the required signatures, and the Supreme Court said, yes, the language is fine, and so it will be on the November ballot this year.
And the court voted 4-3 to allow it to go forward.
Yeah.
This is very interesting. You know, I love these kind of issues because Republicans don't seem to be for this, even though they're for less government and non-government intrusion in your life. So I love when these issues come up because I can kind of, you know, tweak that a little bit, that issue there. We have a lot of conservatives, though, in the state who are actually for this. They've seen their parents go through medical issues, serious medical, life-threatening, and sometimes life-ending issues, where medical marijuana, although it has been procured previously illegally for them. I personally know of several people who use medical marijuana for family members who were ill with cancer, and this helped them a great deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for those who say, well, what about the pill form of marijuana? I say, balderdash. That's right, balderdash. And here's why. Reagan liked that.
I did.
Because it hasn't been perfected. It doesn't have all of the benefits of just the plant. And why do we want to make the pharmaceutical companies even richer than they already are, Reagan?
Well, that's a very good question, yeah. I mean, they've got their hands in just about everybody's pocket, unless you're only about 6 months old, you know, and then in the parents' pocket at that.
So this November, as you know, Reagan and I are for this. And this November, go out and vote. Yeah, you say, I want my Tough TV, and you say, I want my medical marijuana. And gosh darn it, we're going to get it. Because you need 60%. Well, yeah. We have about 82% for this.
You know, the polls are showing overwhelming support, but keep in mind that a poll is merely a snapshot of where a certain amount of voters are at any given time.
Yes.
And as Al just said, these constitutional amendments have to get a 60% positive endorsement of the total electorate on that day in order to become law, and that is not an easy hill to climb. So don't sit back and say, "Oh, it's in the bag." It's all done.
No, it's not in the bag because already the disinformation campaign
It's going to be an expensive campaign.
has begun.
Yeah.
Well, let's just talk with House Speaker Will Weatherford, for instance, a Republican of Wesley Chapel. I have no idea where Wesley Chapel is, but I'll have to look that up. He respectfully disagreed with the court ruling, said he hoped voters would reject this truly radical amendment. See, they got to use words like radical because it scares people. Remember, it's all about fear, folks. Well, fight the fear. You don't have to be succumbing to the fear rhetoric of politicians because you're smart, and the reason why you're smart, you listen to Florida Roundtable, and you watch us on Tough TV. So the quote is, make no mistake, this is not about compassionate medical marijuana. Well, actually it is, Will. This is about the Coloradification of Florida, where the end game is a pot shop on every street corner. That is so far from the truth and so ridiculous. And you know what? The only reason I'm repeating it is to make fun of it. Reagan?
All right. Well, let us pause along the network line here. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We will be joined by mystery murder writer turned historian Daniel Stashower when our conversation continues following these messages. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are joined at this point in the program by Daniel Stashower, the award-winning author of The Beautiful Cigar Girl. Now, that sounds intriguing, but... I
know, I want to read that one as well, right?
We do, yeah. Dan, welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The actual occasion of our visit, and this seems to be a year of conspiracies and whatnot. We went past the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination, and of course, all the folks out there arguing pro and con different conspiracies. This is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and you have gone back to a much older conspiracy, the secret plot to murder Lincoln before the Civil War, and you have put this all into a book called The Hour of Peril from our friends at Minotaur Books. Dan, now before we get to the book itself, you're an award-winning detective writer. You've gone into actual history. So tell us a little bit about yourself and then how it is that you came to decide this book was necessary.
I've always been fascinated by mystery stories and by detective stories in particular. You know, I grew up on the Sherlock Holmes stories, and in time I wrote a biography of Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. I developed a real taste for writing nonfiction, but my enthusiasm for detectives never left me. And there is one of the world's most famous detectives at the center of this story, Alan Pinkerton, and that's what drew me in. That's what drew me to the story.
Well, so Alan Pinkerton, a thumbnail sketch here, as when we'll start to kind of piece this together and tease the folks with this. I mean, he stumbles into this almost. But tell us about Alan Pinkerton a little bit.
Well, Pinkerton is a tough nut. He's scrappy. He's grizzled, quick to anger. He was born in Scotland. He got into trouble with the law in Scotland. And he came to America as a cooper, a barrel maker. And it looks like he's going to go on quietly making barrels for the rest of his life. And one day he's out cutting wood for barrel staves, and he stumbles across a group of counterfeiters dividing their ill-gotten spoils around a campfire. And the next day he leads the local sheriff on a raid and rounds them up. So the next thing you know, Pinkerton is a lawman. And soon after that, he becomes something entirely new in America at that time, a private detective. And his logo is a stern, unblinking eyeball, glaring out over the words, "We never sleep." And soon that logo, the glaring eyeball, brings a new phrase into the American language, private eye.
Aha. All right.
How did Alan Pinkerton come up with the concept of private detective?
At the time, America's railroads were expanding at an absolutely fantastic rate, but there was no single authority to protect them because they crossed over various jurisdictions. So there wasn't any controlling body. The government hadn't set anything up yet. Pinkerton more or less claimed this authority for himself. He literally designed his own badge.
So this was basically at the behest of the railroads, which was the big transportation industry of its time.
Absolutely. It was absolutely explosive at that time. And Pinkerton worked for various independent railroads, was on commission from hired by the presidents of these various railroads. And in fact, one of his biggest clients at the beginning of his career was the Illinois Central Railroad. And the Illinois Central also had a lawyer on retainer, and his name was Abraham Lincoln.
And it doesn't end there, because through the railroad work, he also became acquainted with a West Point graduate who had given up the Army because there was more money in railroads.
That's right, and that was George B. McClellan, who was to loom large in the lives of both Lincoln and Pinkerton. Pinkerton was devoted to McClellan. He thought he was a great man. And, of course, the two of them would work side by side in the early years of the Civil War with as history will record, very mixed results.
Well, now, as your story unfolds, we don't begin with an assassination plot of Abraham Lincoln. Allan Pinkerton is retained by a railroad that is concerned about the safety of their bridges. That's
absolutely right. The Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore Railroad was very concerned because they were essentially the vital connecting link between North and South at the time. And it was feared that agitators with Confederate sympathies were going to attack the vulnerable wooden bridges where this railroad line crossed over water, and therefore cut off communications between North and South. And that's what Allan Pinkerton was doing. That's how he happened to be on the scene in Baltimore at the time when this plot against Lincoln's life was being hatched.
Let's talk about this plot. Most people, of course, know about the plot that actually succeeded in the assassination of Lincoln, but not many people know about this plot, which was put into effect right around the time right before he was going to be inaugurated.
Yes, that's right. And what makes the situation dangerous and difficult is that there's just no easy way to get from Springfield to Washington at this time. Lincoln needs to get from his home in Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C. For his inauguration. He's taking a 13-day train journey. And as he does, the air is filled with rumors of a plot against his life. There are rumors that he will be shot, or he will be stabbed, or he will be blown up in his train. And in Maryland, where the train will cross below the Mason-Dixon line for the first time, Allan Pinkerton is there. He's on the scene, but he's racing the clock, trying to uncover evidence of the plot that he can take to Lincoln and convince him to change his plans. But this is very much running counter to what Lincoln himself wants to do. Yeah. He's hoping to use this journey as a sort of goodwill tour. At each stop, he gets out of the train, he gives a little speech, he wades into the crowd, and he shakes hands. For him, that's the whole point of the exercise. But it made him a security nightmare. And it's a well-publicized journey. I mean, somebody who's plotting and wants to kill him, all they have to do is look at the daily newspaper. I mean, the schedule is out there almost minute by minute, exactly where the president's going to be and what he's doing. That's the problem, exactly. Lincoln is tethered to this moment-by-moment itinerary. There are time cards where it is down to the minute. At 11:24, he's going to be here. At 11:27, he's going to be here. And crowds are thronging to these places to catch a glimpse of him. Pinkerton realized that in order to ensure his safety, he was going to have to break away from this time schedule and move Lincoln ahead of schedule and sort of sneak him through Washington in a kind of quarterback sneak. I think it's important that we
explain to folks who may not be aware of it, there is no federal protection in these years. He's got a Zouave colonel. He has a personal friend who is a big horse of a man, Ward Lehman. But there is no Secret Service. There is no FBI out there watching his every move, trying to protect him. The safety arrangements are left to individual cities and chiefs of police and mayors and state governors and things of that nature.
Lincoln believed that he was public property, and it wasn't in his political interests to be seen to be hiding from real or imagined enemies. And he said this in his inaugural address. He said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." There's a quote from John Nicolay, who was his personal secretary, that gives a very interesting take on this. And Nicolay said, "He knew that incitements to murder him were not uncommon in the South, but he positively refused to torment himself with precautions for his own safety. He said that both friends and strangers must have daily access to him, and that his life was therefore in reach of anyone, sane or mad, who was ready to murder and be hanged for it."
So, in other words, he was fully aware that he could be assassinated at any time, and he had a certain amount of acceptance to that.
You know, you didn't have to be a great detective in order to uncover that. All you had to do was walk down the street in a slaveholding state or elsewhere, and you'd hear people saying the most outrageous things, calling for Lincoln's head during this tumultuous time. By the time Lincoln set off for Washington, 7 states had already seceded. So everything was up in the air. People were terribly anxious to see which way it was going to go, and Lincoln himself was receiving threats by the bushel in Springfield. He had come to personify the issue of slavery that was about to divide the nation, and a lot of people felt that the only way to resolve this issue was to get rid of Lincoln.
What's interesting, Reagan, and of course Daniel, is there was no law against threatening the president's life at that time either.
You know, there were a lot of things that wouldn't come into practice until later. There was no Secret Service. There was, as you mentioned earlier, there was no official detail. So Lincoln was protected only by this unofficial team of people who kind of appointed themselves as his bodyguards. And between them, even inside that circle, there were people arguing about which one of them was really in control, which one of them was responsible for Lincoln's safety. So it was just a mess, and Lincoln himself did not want to deal with it. He wanted to be available to the people. At every stop on this journey, he would hold what was called a handshaking levee, where he would just plant himself in one spot, and a line that stretched along the street for several blocks would form, and people would just come through the hotel where he was staying and shake his hand like a pump handle and exchange a few words with him and then get swept along. Nothing like today.
Absolutely not. And this is rather amazing. So here is Alan Pinkerton. He's been retained by the railroad to guard the bridges. He starts suspecting that there is a plot going along, and that's where I want to pick up the story of how this develops. I mean, you don't just send a telegram to the President of the United States, hey, they're going to shoot you in Baltimore. Lincoln would laugh him off the train.
Well, also, want to learn about Kate Warren, the first female private eye.
Absolutely. So, tell you what we'll do. Let us pause along our network line here. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is Daniel Stashower, the author of The Hour of Peril, from our friends at Minotaur Books, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com, and our conversation will continue following these messages. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, historian Daniel Stashower. He's also a marvelous detective writer. This Hour of Peril that Dan has written, it reads very much like a mystery thriller. This is not cut and dried write history. So, Daniel, our hats off to you in that regard. A plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln on his way to the inaugural. And Alan Pinkerton, our premier detective, the first in the country's history, kind of stumbles into this thing, and he's got a very limited time to put together a team to deal with it and convince the president. So let's talk about this. How in the world does Pinkerton start to piece things together?
He was already in Baltimore, as we were discussing before the break, to protect Samuel Felton's railroad that passed through Baltimore. But while he's there, he catches sight of a larger plan, a plan against President Lincoln's life. But he realizes immediately that if he's going to take this to President-elect Lincoln, he is going to have he's going to need to have a smoking gun. He's going to need to have absolutely ironclad evidence. Well, earlier, one of his men had insinuated himself into a meeting of a group of men who were plotting to carry out an attempt on Lincoln's life when his train arrived in Baltimore on his scheduled train journey. And at this meeting, secret ballots were to be drawn, and one was marked in red to designate the assassin. No one was to know who drew this red ballot, and in this way, the identity of the honored patriot, as they called him, would be protected until the last possible instant. But it later emerged that the dice had been stacked, so to speak, and instead of a single red ballot in the ballot box, there were 8 marked in red. And in this way, even if one or two of the chosen assassins should fail to act, at least one of the others would be certain to strike the fatal blow. And as Pinkerton explained, this was a very good plan. It was audaciously simple and efficient, and he said it was much better conceived than the one which finally succeeded 4 years later at Ford's Theater.
So how then does Alan Pinkerton take this? How does he get to the president and convince him that this is for real and things have to be done?
Fortunately, because he has come to know Lincoln 10 years earlier through their work on the Illinois Central Railroad line, he knows that Lincoln knows his name and will trust him. But even this won't be enough. So Pinkerton makes contact with Lincoln's party as it's traveling from Springfield to Washington through someone he's worked with before, a man named Norman Judd. And in order to make the case and to lay the groundwork, he uses his secret weapon. And this is a young woman named Kate Warren. And she's a female private eye who's working for him at this time. This is one of the aspects of the story that I found just remarkable as I was doing the research. This is obviously before the Civil War. Susan B. Anthony is barely out of the starting gate. It'll be decades before women even have the right to vote. But Pinkerton has women working for him, female operatives working side by side in the field, doing dangerous work alongside men. And Kate Warren, the most valuable and trusted of these agents, is right there in the thick of it in Baltimore.
Yeah, how revolutionary was that? And how did she get the job?
It's almost unfathomable, if you look at it through the lens of those times. One day in 1856, Pinkerton was sitting at his door, and there's a knock, and he looks up and he sees a young woman standing there. She introduces herself. She's a widow, 22 or 23 years old, and she's looking for work. And she says, "I've come to inquire as to whether you would not employ me as a detective." Pinkerton is, absolutely astonished. But to his credit, he gives her a fair hearing. He says, "Well, it's not the custom to employ women as detectives. How exactly do you propose to be of service?" And she's ready for this. She says, "A female detective may go and worm out secrets in ways that are impossible for male detectives." It's her idea that a criminal is going to hide all traces of his guilt from his fellow men, but he won't hide it from his wife or his girlfriend. And the testimony of these women will become invaluable. And if she can strike up a useful friendship and win the confidence of these wives and girlfriends, she'll get them to spill their secrets. And that's exactly what she did, and much more besides.
So she becomes a key player. Now, you said Alan Pinkerton was in Baltimore and he's working on that. Did he have a team with him there on this bridge problem? Or as the presidential relationship to this grew and he became more convinced of it, did he have to call in agents from other operations that he had going around the country?
From the first moments that he began work on this case, he had been concerned about the short time frame in which he had to work. Ordinarily, as he himself admitted, his operations developed very slowly over an enormous period of time. He himself said, our operations are necessarily slow and tedious. It takes time to establish ourselves in position and slowly gather information so as not to draw suspicion. But in this case, because the situation in Maryland, and particularly in Baltimore, was so volatile, he didn't have the time that he usually had in which to work. So he came to Baltimore with a very large team, and he sent them fanning out all across the state, but particularly in Baltimore, to insinuate themselves into groups of men who seemed to be behaving suspiciously, to hang around in bars. There was one Pinkerton man who even trailed a man who was suspicious into a brothel, hoping that in those circumstances, he might talk more freely than he should. They would go anywhere, do anything. And it was, as Pinkerton admitted, not the way he liked to work. He was cutting corners. He was racing the clock, but the circumstances demanded it.
There was no confidence whatsoever in the chief of police of the city of Baltimore at that time either, or in the governor of Maryland.
Both men were obviously under an enormous amount of pressure. Things in Maryland were incredibly volatile at the time, and there were people calling for Maryland secession on an hourly basis. It was assumed in the days leading up to the Civil War that Virginia would secede, and many assumed that Maryland would automatically follow Virginia. In fact, in 1860, the Maryland legislature had drawn up a resolution of support saying that if the Union were to be dissolved, Maryland would cast her lot with her sister states of the South. So Maryland was on record. And if Maryland went Confederate, Washington would be hemmed in by secessionist territory and entirely cut off from the North. And this would likely have meant that the federal government would have had to abandon Washington and reestablish itself in Philadelphia or New York. It would have been a huge, huge step for the Confederacy, perhaps even leading to foreign recognition that the South so desperately needed. So many believed that as Maryland went, so went the nation. So figures like the Baltimore chief of police and the governor of Maryland were under extraordinary pressure.
There were also, of course, the government was still in Washington, and Senator William Seward, who is the Secretary of State designate, has gotten information, sends his son to Lincoln with warnings. Winfield Scott, the Chief of Staff of the Army, very, very worried about it, and it seems as though they were having a hard time convincing the president.
They were having a hard time convincing the president. They were having a hard time convincing anyone, really. A select committee of Congress had been impaneled to investigate the situation, to ferret out what was believed to be threats against the Capitol that were likely to be launched. And several of the figures who were involved in this plot in Baltimore were summoned to Washington to testify. This was before Pinkerton even arrived on the scene. So it was very much in the wind that there were threats against the Capitol and against the president, but it was very, very hard to nail the facts to the wall and to get the kind of concrete evidence that Lincoln was going to need if he was going to change his plans at all.
Tell you what, Dan, we're going to need to take another pause along the network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, Daniel Stashower. He is a detective, mystery writer extraordinaire, and now historian. His new book, The Hour of Peril, from Minotaur Publishing, The Secret Plot to Murder Abraham Lincoln Before the Civil War. And a couple of more points, I think, that make the story unique and well worth the time spent to take a good hard look at it. So we'll invite you to stay where you are. Our conversation continues following these messages. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, historian Daniel Stashower. His new book, The Hour of Peril, The Secret Plot to Murder Lincoln Before the Civil War. And most people know that Lincoln was assassinated right at the very end of the Civil War. So obviously, Alan Pinkerton and all the folks associated with him managed to get Mr. Lincoln through Baltimore and into what? Well, you want to see how they did it, you need to pick up the book and give it a good read. That's what you do. But Dan, one of the things that I like about this is that you have a lengthy epilogue where you come back and talk about what happened to the key players, what they did. For example, Kate Warren dies very young and untimely.
She does. She had gone on, following this episode in Baltimore, to set up an agency of female detectives working under Pinkerton's supervision, but run by her out of a headquarters in Chicago. And they were successful for 4 years. But Kate herself passed away very young, and this was a terrific blow to Pinkerton. He felt that she was really his finest operative, and he said, "She never let me down." And in fact, she's buried in the Pinkerton family plot in Illinois. Pinkerton took that kind of interest in his agents. So too is Timothy Webster, who also played a key role in this drama and was later hanged as a spy in Richmond in the early years of the Civil War. This was a devastating blow to Pinkerton, that a man that he had so trusted and had done such valiant work for him became the first Union spy hanged, and it was an enormous blow to Pinkerton. And he too, Pinkerton arranged to bring the remains back at the end of the war and bury them in his family plot. He took that kind of interest in his operatives. To him, particularly those people who were there with him at the beginning, were family.
And how about Alan Pinkerton himself?
Well, for better or worse, Pinkerton's actions in Baltimore led directly to his work as McClellan's chief of intelligence during the Civil War. And this didn't go great. Mistakes were made. But I always refer people who are interested in this issue to a book called The Secret War for the Union by Edwin Fischel, which clearly suggests that Pinkerton's failures were not as absolute as is commonly believed. Pinkerton has been the target of blame for his wildly inflated estimates of enemy troop strength in the early years of the war. But Fischel suggests that these failures have been exaggerated, and the records make it clear that McClellan himself was prone to inflate the size of the forces he was facing. But there's no getting around the fact that Pinkerton and McClellan made plenty of lapses in judgment in the early years of the war. Of course, everyone knows that McClellan was replaced eventually. Pinkerton went back to private practice as a detective, and therefore he was completely out of the picture in 1865 when Lincoln was assassinated. The story goes that Pinkerton wept bitterly when he received the news of Lincoln's assassination and felt if only he had been there, he might have been able to do something to prevent it. Now, of course, there's no way of knowing that, but one can understand his feelings at the time.
One other thought before we have to go, and that is Alan Pinkerton pretty much put his finger on the chief of police of Baltimore, who left Baltimore, did Confederate service, and tell us that story.
This was Marshal Kane, a man who felt that he was treated extremely badly during this episode, and perhaps he was. Marshal Kane was overheard by Pinkerton to say that it wouldn't be necessary to detail any police to protect Lincoln when he came through Washington. Pinkerton jumped to the conclusion that this meant that Pinkerton really didn't much care what happened to Lincoln when he came through Baltimore. But there's evidence to suggest that Kane had his own plan to ensure Lincoln's safety during this episode, and that perhaps Kane would have taken his own measures to see that things went smoothly. There's no way of knowing that after when the war broke out. Kane did do service to the Confederacy and spent time in prison soon afterwards, and was under extremely hard conditions. And
later on, he comes back and becomes the mayor of Baltimore.
Shows you just how fluid the situation was.
That's politics.
The man who spent time in prison goes on to become mayor of the city.
Wow. Well, Dan, it's a marvelous book. It is. It reads like a mystery murder thriller. It's a page turner. You get into this thing and you don't want to put it down. The book is The Hour of Peril: The Secret Plot to Murder Lincoln Before the Civil War. Minotaur Books is the publisher. We presume it's available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and Amazon.com. We'll say thank you and hope that we can visit again. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll be back with a closing thought following these messages. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Daniel Stashower. There was actually, we didn't get to talk about it, but people deny that there was a plot to kill Lincoln before the Civil War, and that's why I wanted to do that little follow-up about the mayor of Baltimore being a loyal Confederate and coming back. The plot was genuine, but boy, I'll tell you what, it is 50 years after Kennedy, 150 years after Lincoln, we're still arguing these points.
Interesting how Alan Pinkerton was a sharp cookie, and maybe if he would have been around in 1865, the president wouldn't have been assassinated.
Quite possible.
Quite possible.
Quite possible.
Winner and loser of the week in Florida politics.
Yes, sir.
Reagan.
All
of
right.
course, the winner is John Morgan.
Yep.
We happen to have John Morgan on our show. It went national. We were on the Tough TV network nationwide. Thank you very much. And thanks to Lou for that. The state confirmed Friday the campaign to legalize medical marijuana, led by a ubiquitous trial lawyer, John Morgan, obtained the required 683,149 valid signatures. And by the way, John Morgan spent more than $4 million of his own money to get this.
At one point, I guess the estimate went up that he was paying $4 a signature for the. Yeah, and that would bring it right up close.
So congratulations to John. Loser of the week, another John Boehner. You pull many millions of dollars from Florida for GOP U.S. House candidates, yet you're unwilling to take up a bill delaying most Florida flood insurance premium increases for 4 years. Message received. GOP to Florida. Drop dead.
Yeah, that's about the size of it. And boy, do we have, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people affected along both of our coasts by that.
And briefly, of course, Congressman U.S. Representative Raydell, his letter of resignation to House Speaker John Boehner Monday. Of course, he has resigned and marked an about face for the embattled congressman. And this is an interesting fact. He has now found that his tenure of 389 days, a little more than a year, is the second shortest among 132 Floridians to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. Who served the least? This is a man named conservative Democrat Silas Niblack. And this is a former slave owner. And back in 1870, you have to go back to 1870.
I remember him.
He served just 33 days in office. Yes.
He and I went to the same school together separately.
You know, you've held up well, though, Reagan, I must say. He served just 33 days. So there you go. That's the end of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we do want to say thank you for your time this week. We invite your comments. Send us an email. We still get snail mail here at the Florida News Network. That, of course, entirely welcome. People you'd like to hear or some reactions you have to our commentary. Thank you for your time. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll see you again in 1 week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.